I'm really grateful to be before GAE, and actually in my 4 years, this is my first time testifying before this committee, so it's nice to join you all, and it's wonderful to be here. And I want to thank the committee membership and leadership for raising House Bill 7206. There are a variety of components in this bill that are relevant to my constituency that I serve. And if I had come before this committee not having experienced the beginning of this week that I did, my testimony would have looked very different. So I had planned to come to talk about the importance of regulatory oversight and guaranteed intervenor status for constituencies before the Connecticut Siting Council. The town of East Windsor, which some members of the Siting Council mentioned that it is the most solar dense town in the state of Connecticut, has had many different iterations before the Siting Council. And I think that we need to ensure in the proceedings that we give parties intervenor status who are due their voice before the Connecticut Siting Council. I have one array in my community in particular that the builder who was developing property was noticed of a siting provision, and then houses were built and the homeowners were not notified that a solar array was coming their way. The front door of the solar array is 127 feet, the inverters, from the front door of someone's house. And on Tuesday, while I was sitting in Veterans and Military Affairs, I was notified that it was on fire. And so right now, my community is engaging in some pretty complicated navigation about what's going to happen and who will make the determination about if and when this can be turned back on, and if adequate safety procedures have been taken place to address what's going forward. So in addition to strongly supporting the strengthening of the proceedings before the Siting Council, transparency for utility expenditures, which I strongly support in the bill, I think that this committee should consider making the utility companies and generators, so it's complicated in the way we regulate energy in our space. Anytime you consider regulating one body, you have to consider the transmission organizations, the utility companies, and the generators, because we often forget them in the way we regulate, and we have to consider very carefully how they can communicate with their captive audiences. And I believe that all communications by all three of these organizations should be subject to FOIA. And so those were my intentions to testify originally, but now I believe that the Siting Council should be given the authority to make determinations about re-energization after a critical event. I don't think it should just be the Siting Council. I don't think they have the expertise alone. I think PURA needs to be involved in that decision-making process, and I think the town needs a final say, the fire marshal and the building inspector. But I think that this committee is the right place to make considerations about who has oversight in these critical events. And I think that this bill is an opportunity to address what is becoming a very big issue in my community. Thank you, and I'll take any questions.
Thank you. Thank you for your time and your testimony. Are there questions or comments from members of the committee? Representative Blumenthal.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good to see you, Representative Foster.
Good to see you,
thank you for your testimony today. That sounds like a pretty shocking event, and I'm sure it's very concerning for members of your town. And is there any provision right now before re-energization that any sort of fire inspection, building inspection, safety inspection has to take place?
Right now we're operating under the assumption that the fire marshal and building inspector will need to sign off on this process. But this actually has never happened in Connecticut before, so we're going to be foraging the path. And so the path that we're attempting to forage, I hope will be codified in law. You know, I've talked to colleagues. Representative Anderson has a big storage array that's being cited in his district, and we've compared notes many times on this process. And local communities don't have a lot of say before the Siting Council. And that was by design, but it's resulted in some pretty significant consequences. This array that's owned by Nextera has been a pretty persistent nuisance, and the decibel limit that it reaches is right at the threshold. And so it's unusual for a solar array to be very noisy. That is the exception, not the norm. And we have always alleged that we think it's the sign of a problem. And there hasn't really been the ability to leverage either the Siting Council or another entity to take action on these complaints. So last year, members of this committee, in collaboration with Judiciary and Energy and Technology, have worked to pass House Bill 5507. But the way that that legislation was enacted, it doesn't allow retroactive control over these arrays that were cited under one condition and things changed moving forward. You can't hold them accountable to new legislation when they were cited and approved under different circumstances. But we have a unique opportunity before us right now. It is currently de-energized, and we have before us the opportunity to make sure that this never happens again. And what frightens me about the way this happened in the current proceeding is that on Friday, emergency services were called out to arcing on the wire, and it's pretty horrifying. It's like a ball of blue light glowing on a pole. There was an explosion hours later, and the system was re-energized. And so I want to make sure that there's really rigorous accountability for safety, but also siting, because 127 feet away from someone's front door is too close for inverters. And I think we need to make sure that although this project was cited under specific circumstances, there was this concurrent building that was happening, and the homeowners who live here were really given a really unfortunate sort of, handed an unfortunate deck of cards, because they didn't have the ability to be an intervener before the siting council, and now any future improvements or repairs that are necessary, I believe, should have to go through the siting council for consideration. And then we need to make sure that we have appropriate regulatory oversight. I'm working on drafting an amendment for a bill to ensure this accountability for critical safety incidences. We have that in the natural gas space, but we don't for generators in the renewable space. So we're working really hard on trying to figure out where there are gaps in our legislation that create accountability for these generators. And the siting council really has a lot more oversight over generators. PURA has oversight over the EDCs, and the TOs have oversight that's more FERC heavy than it is state level. And so we have these gaps in state oversight, and I'm hoping that this bill is one opportunity to fill some holes and make sure that my constituency can be protected by state agency.
Well, thank you for that answer and for sharing this experience with us. I certainly think it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to cite something this large and potentially dangerous and then leave it alone forever. There should be some state oversight going forward, and something to ensure that safety procedures are being followed, and that one hand knows what the other hand is doing, and people are properly informed and heard. I wanted to ask you about some of the less, shall we say, emergent aspects of the issue. Several provisions of this bill are aimed at, I guess I could say, roughly increasing the ability of the Office of the Consumer Counsel to participate and advocate for consumers in siting council proceedings, and I guess better informing the siting council. There's a provision to retain an independent engineer. Do you support those provisions, first of all, and how and why do you think they would be helpful to the siting council and to the ratepayers of Connecticut?
Yeah, it's very interesting. There was a Superior Court decision today that has this footnote that you all should check out later that kind of answers the problem. But for a really long time in this building, the utility companies have benefited from what I believe is an intentional bamboozling, where they can say science and legal jargon, and it goes largely unchecked, because we are a citizens legislature, and we don't all have the content area expertise that their army of lobbyists, attorneys, and engineering experts have. And so the best hope we have in these proceedings of representing ourselves better is for OCC and the Siting Council and PURA to have every tool ready at their disposal to push back. I have joked that the lobbying heard for the utility companies and the generators, when they go before there, we will never be able to put the amount of brains and the amount of legal skills and expertise on this work as possible. And that has, for a very long time been their game. It's subterfuge and obfuscation. Like, look over here, legal terms, important science terms, don't pay attention. And when I was on the Energy and Technology Committee, I sat before a presentation and there was a slide that was presented and it actually had an axis that wasn't a continuous series of numbers. Like, it literally was, there was a gap, there was no demarcation that the numbers had changed, and the slide deck showed that there was like a very modest increase in time over the cost, which we all know isn't true. But when you're looking at the data and it's never something you've never seen before, you never had the opportunity to review, it was misrepresented. And I don't believe by accident, but I don't know that, they spent more on their generation of preparation in their testimony than we all make in a single term, in a year in the legislature. I bet each time they come and testify before us on the committee, there's more time is going into their preparation. So their proceedings between PURA and the Siting Council, I mean, our salaries are a very mere fraction of what they spend in each one of those proceedings. So how can our lay constituency, who have their full-time jobs, families to feed, and these really back-breaking bills, how are they ever supposed to come to terms and testify and better represent themselves? The only opportunity we have to give them a chance at a David and Goliath comeback is that we give OCC the ability to support it, and we give them engineering expertise, we give them legal expertise. They have a lot of wonderful legal expertise available to them, but we also give PURA and the Siting Council the ability to consult experts, because the thing is, the utility companies have a huge amount of in-house expertise, but they are consulting whoever they need to make the best case available in everything that they're going for. And the only thing that they have loyalty to are their shareholders. We need people whose fidelity is to the ratepayers and the consumers of Connecticut to be the voice that's leveraged and given expertise. And I think the provisions in this bill make a start at that. I think expanded FOIA provisions do that too.
Those are some very good points. You know, I've often been struck by, at least as I've been able to find it on the Siting Council and even on PURA, like there's just a very vast differential in resources being directed at those proceedings, which are supposed to be adversary proceedings. And it just seems like the deck is totally stacked on one side in terms of the resources, expertise, and person power, and it's not on the side of the ratepayers. So, you know, I certainly think and agree with you that I think increasing the resources and the opportunity to intervene of the OCC and increasing the access to independent engineers who haven't been hired to support a project would be in the interest of the ratepayers.
There should probably be some revolving door provisions there, though, because what I'll say is challenging in this space is that, I apologize, but what is challenging in this space is that the utility companies just pay by economies of scale so much more. And so you're hard pressed to find people who can last a long time in the industry and not be tempted into, you know, a more, you know, greener grasses economically. And so I think there should be revolving door provisions too for their external consultations.
That's a good point, and one we should consider. Additionally, you know, one of the I think the counter arguments we hear against giving OCC or Siting Council or PURA additional resources and engineers is, you know, this is going to cost the ratepayers more money because it's going to ultimately be reimbursable by the utilities or through the public utilities charge. And so what do you think of that counter argument, and what is your response, if any?
The ratepayers are paying for their experts in-house, so you might as well stack the deck in your way. The Connecticut ratepayers, we changed in SB 7 last year. We made it so when you have a proceeding before the utility company and they're challenging the interests of the Connecticut ratepayers, we are finally no longer paying for their expertise in those public hearings. But up until last year, we were paying for all of their work that was infidelity to their shareholders, not their ratepayers. And so we have to tip the scale. And I think of it oftentimes, there are conversations in this utility space about getting advocates to sort of weigh in a way that's more important. I think this is one of the reasons why we need to make sure that membership of PURA and the Siting Council represents ratepayer advocacy, but also has technical expertise, because it's this impossible scale. And I haven't used the word bamboozle ever so much in my whole life, but that's what this game is that they go before this lay committee, and we have folks who have to do the very best with the skills that they have to push back against this Goliath who's saying, we have all this money, we have all these resources, we know better than you. You don't understand how energy policy and regulation works. You don't understand how engineering works. You don't understand how, generation works. And, I had this call this morning with one of the generators around the fire, and there's this back and forth here, who is responsible for the fire? Is it the utility or is it the generator? And the problem is, I have a PhD in nutrition. I don't know. I'd like to know. I want to make sure that my neighbors are safe. My kid's daycare was a half a mile up the street from this fire. I want to make sure that we handle this appropriately, but I don't know. And someone on behalf of us should know. And the only way to do that is to make sure we can hire them and not be outgunned in the fight, because we need to make sure that they have the experts that they need, which means paying. Sometimes you get what you pay for expertise-wise.
Yeah, I will agree with you. My undergraduate degree was in history and literature, so I'm certainly not equipped to understand all the science here. But I really don't understand why then we should be prevented from hiring people who can give us an independent opinion on these matters. And not only on the safety matters, but especially on these massive projects that can cost hundreds of millions or billions of dollars, seize land through eminent domain, all of it reimbursed by the ratepayers for a guaranteed profit of almost 10%. I just see powerful, powerful incentives to build expensively, to build in a way that's not sustainable. And I don't see anywhere near sufficient expertise or resources to challenge any assumptions or data that have been provided. And I think if one of these projects is either denied or changed as a result of increased expertise on the Siting Council or the Office of the Consumer Council, then that would pay these salaries or costs of these individuals hundreds of times over. And so I see this as a very worthwhile investment. I wonder if you could comment on the cost issue and the cost effectiveness issue, because that's something that really concerns me, especially we're having this constant debate about energy prices. And my understanding, you can correct me if I'm wrong, distribution and a little bit of transmission, this is where the utilities make their money.
Correct. And so one of the things that we're struggling with right now is there is a inherently perverse incentive that is guaranteed by a Supreme Court decision, which is one of the ways they try and bamboozle you. That is, they have guaranteed return on all of their investments, or the guaranteed opportunity to get return on their investment before. And unless you give these agencies the opportunity to push back, they get this 10% return. And what is interesting is if you talk to any of the utilities, they'd be like, well, why would we build extra? 10% return. It is a perverse incentive that they are guaranteed. And what is really interesting is this is something I think the Energy and Technology Committee hopes to work on significantly this year. There's a bill on grid enhancing technologies and advanced transmission technologies that's I hope comes out of committee next week. But these actions are regulated in such a complex, interagency mix. There's FERC, and then there's regulation between Siting Council and PURA, and there's oversight and advocacy by OCC, but the utility companies have long benefited from being able to say, oh no, this group doesn't have regulatory ability, and this group doesn't have regulatory ability, and FERC already told us we can do this, and not having the opportunity to really get pushed back. So I think any dollar spent pushing back against their investments in transmission, when they are perhaps gold-plated, when they are perhaps excessive and unnecessary, any dollar you spend pushing back against those investments is a dollar spent benefiting Connecticut ratepayers. And this is the thing that's challenging about things that are a ratepayer impact and the way that we look at ratepayer impact in the General Assembly. There are hundreds of thousands of examples where a dollar spent is hundreds of dollars saved, thousands of dollars saved, millions of dollars saved. And sometimes it's the best path forward, but it is challenging to demonstrate proof of the economic benefit when you're looking in short windows of time. But the thing is, when you dig a little deep into utility investments into transmission, we do not have a grid reliability problem in the Northeast. That is not true in other states. But if we want a reliable grid, we need to make sure that the investments in the grid are appropriate from an engineering standpoint. But having an engineer with structural estimating experience, answering to questions on the Siting Council, answering questions in PURA, that will help knee-jerk reaction whether an investment in a transmission cost makes sense. The cost to dig up a road and lay wires down is the same in transportation, it's the same in water investment, it's the same in electrical investment, and someone who has experience in cost estimating can push back against these numbers. In the absence of that expertise there's no pushback. And the same is said for, is this technology the best choice? Right now, the burden of proof is on the utility company, and the Siting Council accepts or rejects their expertise when they make investments into transmission. And the utility company does the cost estimating. And Siting Council isn't checking those numbers. They don't have that expertise on site. And so when they say the transmission cost is best met by doing these wires and poles, there's not a grid enhancing technology that's better suited, there's not an opportunity to make improvements on the wires and poles instead of building new ones, no one's pushing back, and they have the opportunity to say, we need to replace this spot here. And guess what? They make money. So of course they're going to do it. And assuming that we can just leave capitalism to be good actors and regulate themselves, I think is risky. Our ratepayers are really suffering. And I think that sometimes regulation in this, amping up expertise, amping up advocacy for constituents is exactly what our constituents want from us. I think when they sort of peel back the onion a little bit, they want accountability. They want someone to push back against the utility companies.
Oh, thank you. And I was wondering if you could comment on the grid enhancing technologies part of the bill, if you have any perspective on that.
Yeah, so we have this bill in energy and technology this year where we are looking at alternatives to traditional transmission projects. Well, these aren't really being considered unless the utility company makes a choice to make that investment. What is really challenging about the way that they get cited and approved right now is if they choose a technology and they deploy it, but they don't turn on any of its capacity, they still get reimbursement for the technology that they paid for, even if it's not deployed to its full benefit. We do not have an accountability mechanism to say, you put in smart meters. Smart meters are supposed to be a return on investment of X percentage, and the way you deployed them, they're built, they're in the systems, but they're not using all their technology that's available to them. You don't have the appropriate savings. We have no way to hold them accountable to appropriately deploying that technology. And the ratepayers paid for that technology, whether it's a brick in it, the way it's utilized, or whether it's deployed to its full capacity. And so we need to make sure that there's accountability. And if there's technology that makes the cost of doing business cheaper, we would be stupid not to adopt it.
Well, I really appreciate all the expertise that you've helped deliver to the committee today. Obviously we have a limited aperture into this issue. We're focused on the structures and processes that are providing this oversight of our capital projects by utilities, of the reimbursement of them by the ratepayers, and certainly from my perspective, and I think the cognizance of the committee perspective, the deck seems to be stacked overwhelmingly against the ratepayers currently. And if we can even that a bit, I'm not going to comment on specific energy policy, but at least we'll have a process where the ratepayers are being properly represented, where there's expertise, where this oversight mechanism can actually do its job in a way that we on the outside can say, this looks reliable. So I think that's our window into this. I'm very interested in pursuing it. And, I think Connecticut consumers need to have a better process that they can rely on.
And you have oversight over auditing provisions. So I also encourage you to extend those to the fullest extent of your possibility, because there's a lot of programs that these public utilities are administering that are being internally audited. They bragged to me about the home energy efficiency program last week. They spend $3.5 million in evaluation, and none of the evaluation includes demonstration of how they came to their numbers. There's like a bunch of case studies in it, and then there's this cost saving amount. Like, those programs work. They're effective, but do we know that they're working? Do we know that every dollar spent is resulting in the return on investment it's supposed to? So I think we should have the auditors of public accounts, who I'm a huge fan of. I think we should allow them to audit all of those programs and provisions.
Well, I think you may have to come back to one of our future public hearings this session, because
This might be my new
you
favorite
may
committee.
be predicting the future of some bills in this committee. But I would just say thank you for being here. Thank you for contributing your expertise to our processes. Energy bills in Connecticut are way too high. They're unsustainable, and the processes that exist for vetting what goes into them just simply aren't up to the task. And we need to unstack the deck and make sure that there's proper oversight, accountability, and transparency. And we look forward to working with you and the
Thank
Energy
you.
and Technology Committee on making that a reality.
Thank you very much for this opportunity.